Hello and welcome to the yet another edition of E-Expression, a E-Dialogue for discussing current affairs. Today we have with us Dr. Raghuram Rajan, former Governor of Reserve Bank of India, who's speaking to us from Chicago. Welcome, Doctor, to our E-Expressions.
Thanks for having
First,
me.
we are meeting after many years discussing here at the New Indian Express. First question is everybody asking, because since you were the RBI governor and we have RBI governor announcing various measures there to revive the economy. You must be reading about it. Yesterday, Government of India announced yet another stimulus, taking the total stimulus during the COVID to about $5 billion, 30 lakh crore rupees. That becomes almost $5 billion. What do you think? Is it good enough to revive the economy, which is shrinking at the rate of minus 8.3%?
I think the impact of COVID, certainly as seen in industrial countries, has been huge. So if you look at the actual stimulus in terms of spending that is taking place, for example, in the United Kingdom, it's about 20 percentage points of GDP, right? In the Indian context, that would be about 40 lakh crores in additional spending. Of course, we are a much poorer country and can afford much less, but we also came into the pandemic with a very, very strained fiscal situation. Years of budgetary overruns hidden away here, there, and everywhere. As a result, we have had much more limited room to spend. Now, it's important to remember that spending during the pandemic takes two forms. One is to help households that are in difficulty survive. The other is to help small and medium enterprises that are running out of cash to be able to continue production. Otherwise, they will close down and many will close down permanently. I see this more as relief, not so much stimulus. Time for stimulus will come when the economy picks up more strongly. After the pent up demand slows down, there will be need for stimulus. We are some distance away from that. Right now, we are enjoying a recovery partly based on pent up demand. We have to see what is the sustainable level of demand after this falls off. Then there will be time for stimulus. But right now, the efforts have been, there has been some targeted effort at the small and medium enterprises. Obviously, people want more, but the government has to see what it can do within its resources. I would focus much more on relief at this point to the extent that is possible. And I would carve out more space, fiscal space, if we can.
Why do you call it a relief? Why not stimulus? Because Government of India is calling it a stimulus, and you are saying it is relief in what terms? Because they have announced it thrice. You must have seen the first stimulus, which was announced a couple of months ago, and the second followed after that, and third has come yesterday. Do you think the first stimulus, whatever they gave, you call it a relief, did it have any impact on what it was objective was? Has it achieved its objective in
Well,
6 months?
I think the most important thing the government did was the free food grain, as well as some targeted sort of cash transfers to poorer households. And many of us have been saying more needs to be done of that kind uh, to support the poorer households. Now, I call this relief for an important reason, that it's as much about the supply side of the economy as the demand side. Whenever you talk about stimulus, you say demand is too weak, let's add to the demand, right? Uh, but what is happening in the pandemic is your ability to produce is shrinking in the economy. Uh, think of a small and medium or a medium enterprise which is closing down permanently. Then when it closes down, jobs are lost. The ability of the country to produce is actually atrophying. And relief is an attempt to prevent that so that when demand comes back, there is supply waiting to be enhanced at that point. So, in a situation of weak demand, you would not see high inflation. Today in India, you're seeing high rates of inflation. Some of it is undoubtedly food, but some of it is because our supply chains are in great difficulty. Some entities aren't able to produce. And as a result, prices are going up despite weak demand. That's saying that there's also a supply side problem. And that's why I say, let's also think about relief, because all too often we miss that when we talk about stimulus. It's about helping the entities which will not survive, including households, poor households that may have enormous difficulty during this time.
So this is an interesting thing you have defined is stimulus for the demand side, because from 91 onwards, when the famous economic reform started under Singh Sarkar, Manmohan Singh, N.K. Singh, and Monty Singh, at that time they introduced reform which was meant to increase supply side model basically. And it has been continued without interruption for the past 30 years almost. Now you're saying stimulus is meant for a demand enhancement rather than supply creation, because India has already accessed supplies in various places. So do you think that stimulus is yet to come and stimulus is required for demand expansion, which is not happening at the moment as it is required?
So, well, first, let me be careful in saying some aspects of protecting the supply side will also help the demand side, right? If you give more money to poorer households, they'll spend, and that spending is demand. So one has to be careful in economics. Everything is linked. But I would say that, going forward, what we're going to see is that because some fraction of the economy doesn't come back until we have a full virus, given that mobility levels still haven't gone back to 100%, given that if the virus expands once again, the pandemic expands once again, people are going to be scared about going to restaurants, to shops, and so on. You don't see that right now. You see a lot more crowding, but it could reverse. In that case, what will happen is that demand will be weak for the foreseeable future. And as a result, you may need some stimulus measures at that point. Now, what form would those stimulus measures take? Often they take the form that would enhance demand for the widest segment of society as possible. In India, infrastructure is that. If you can build out more infrastructure, you increase demand for steel, increase demand for aluminum, cement, this, that, and you also create jobs, unskilled jobs for the most part, which is very necessary to occupy some of the workers we have. So I would say that we should be preparing now for that massive expansion in infrastructure spending that we will need to lift the economy as we get rid of the virus, because at that point we'll find demand is still too weak.
Professor, my colleague Shankar has also joined now. I'm asking the question about you're saying the demand creation has to happen in Indian economic situation. When we were taught economics, we were taught Rostow's principle of economic growth, that how the economy grows from agriculture to manufacturing to tertiary sector. Suddenly we found in India the whole model was reversed, but we went straight away into tertiary sector. Services contributes about 60% of the GDP in India. And because of COVID, why now? Because services sector depend on basically people going to restaurants, going flying away, staying in hotels and whatever happening. So don't you think because of this strong excessive dependence on services in India, which is basically an agrarian society even now, because 55% of the people still depend on agriculture and they get only 15% of the GDP. Don't you think the whole model could not handle this pandemic if there was slowdown of demand because entire economy are depending on services?
Well, there are services and services, right? What you're talking about is the high contact services, hospitality, restaurants, tourism, all of which have
Financial services.
been, yeah, which have been dampened by the virus. On the other hand, there are contactless services, what you and I are doing right now, talking. To the extent that services can be provided from home, unlike manufacturing, that has continued. In fact, one of the saving graces of industrial countries is about 45% of jobs in the US can be done from home at a distance. And those 45% of jobs probably account for much more than the majority of value added. So in a sense, lockdowns are much less harmful in the United States because so much more can be done from home. I teach my entire class from home now. And education services, as you know, are a big part of value added. So what I'm saying is, yes, you're right that some of the high contact services are deeply affected by the pandemic. But on the other hand, the low contact services are actually not, especially if you can conduct them at a distance. Of course, India is not at the level of sophistication overall that, for example, the US has. my colleagues estimate in Bangladesh, which can be thought of as similar to India in its the nature of work, only 10% of the jobs can be done at home. And so what that means is poorer countries have a harder time maintaining economic activity. So in that context, your point is right that manufacturing has come back faster in a country like China. Even in India, manufacturing is coming back quite strongly to meet the unmet or the pent-up demand. But we follow a growth path that seems the most optimal given our constraints. If we had fantastic infrastructure, if we had a highly educated labor force, perhaps we would be a real force in manufacturing also. But we take what we get. I think what we should do is make it easier for all kinds of businesses to open up so that we can, in fact, provide those jobs that you're talking about.
One of the issues that has been discussed is the sequencing and the quantity of the stimulus. And the government, the people for the government are sort of suggesting that there's a new coinage now, conservative socialism. So that you don't spend, but you then spend targeted amounts. And we know from anecdotal evidence that a large number of face-to-face and other smaller establishments have closed down in India. And that, so how does the government address the issue of scarring, short-term, medium-term, long-term scarring? I mean, in Pune, on the main road, 100 restaurants, parlors closing down. Now, obviously, these are people who may not have borrowed from the banking system, from the formal system, but must have used family capital, pool, savings, personal. How does this translate? I mean, this is an unknown, really. I mean, how does this translate?
No, this is the issue that we were talking about just now, which is the need for relief in order to protect the body of the economy, to ensure that the body doesn't atrophy. And the body will atrophy most in these areas, the high contact services provided by small and medium enterprises, the restaurant along the highway, which will close down. The question is, can it open up again? Or is it that when it opens up, the lack of credit, the size of the debts it already has, maybe with money lenders, maybe all the gold in the family has already been pledged out. And as a result, it finds it difficult. That is when you will see that the size of the economy itself, its productive capacity has shrunk. And that is why I keep saying, let's separate this into two pieces. Relief to protect the body of the economy, stimulus to generate more demand. Now is the time for relief. Demand stimulus will come down the line when the economy is prepared to ramp up again. But right now, protect the economy, which means, of the government measures suggested so far, the one on small and medium enterprise credit, I think, is the most attuned to relief. I don't know the details of how it is being rolled out. I hope we're rolling it out in a sensible way, not to create more new NPAs. But if it is rolled out sensibly, it does give small and medium enterprises a lifeline, which is very important at this time for all the reasons you pointed out. But I think that to some extent, we have to ask ourselves, and I keep saying this, have we used the resource envelope that is available for us? It's all very well to say I'm being conservative, but are you being overly conservative because you haven't used the resource envelope? We talked about privatization. Markets are at a high again. Why aren't we rolling out our public sector enterprises and selling them at this point?
Actually, so this is the point that I was actually coming to. I mean, there are two arguments here. One is what is the headroom the government has? The government's argument has been that we will try and use the stimulus we can use it much more effectively when the entire economy is opened up. So we'll get a bigger bang for the buck, the multiplier effect and stuff like that. The other aspect which I have been arguing and have been writing about is basically, have you raised the headroom? Have you raised the resources that you can raise? So one suggestion I had put out was that you create a Temasek or a sovereign fund like entity, put all your PSU holdings in that entity, and if you can't sell, at least raise bonds against them. And PSUs contribute something like 80,000 crores of dividend every year. So there is this constant pushback on that, is that the valuation is not right. But I mean, it is a question. Do you think that there is an ideological issue about privatization with the government?
I don't think it's an ideological issue. I think it's well, let me put it this way: the valuation will never be right, no matter where the stock market is. I've heard this for the last 10 years, right? We've been through ups and downs in the market. It's never enough, right? And so the question is, what is that the market is missing that the bureaucrats see? And it's both bureaucratic as well as political. If there was strong political will to do this, it would be done. But I want to just emphasize once again, I've already said this to Prabhu, that don't confuse stimulus, which is what is needed when the economy is back and demand is still weak, with the relief you're talking about, protecting the parts of the economy which will die and never come back during this process. Relief is needed now. The government makes a mistake if it thinks it's stimulus. It's not stimulus, it's relief. And you essentially keep the body of the economy alive, and we're not doing enough of that. And as you correctly put it, we could raise resources more cleverly, even if we felt, our ability to issue debt was limited. Now, there are people who would argue, if you can issue debt and invest it productively, the rating agencies would be reasonably happy with you. And if you made the case that over the medium term, you would return to fiscal consolidation, and you were transparent. Look, we've fudged our budget math so much that nobody believes it. If we return to transparency and had institutions suggesting that we would be transparent, for example, the fiscal commission that the various finance commissions have proposed, I think we stand a chance of doing more. And I fear that what we are seeing is excuses for not doing stuff when in fact we could do more.
Professor, I will intervene here. Shankar Justin, because he's talking about resources since he has been the RBI governor. So I'm going to be straight into getting into deficit. If Trump administration can print about $3 trillion, why can't Indian government resort to the same thing, print more currency and give in stimulus what you're talking about? Why Indian establishment run by everybody else is more worried about what agencies, rating agencies would do by sticking to only 3% of the deficit, what is happening? Why can't India resort to, you have been RBI governor, why can't India for a temporary period print more currency rather than what's Shankar here affected by reform agenda, and he's also part of that thing. Okay, we should not print currency, but we should create some kind of SPV where family silver can be sold to others and then can be the resources. But why can't we go for that kind of objective? What Trump has done, what Sunak is doing in UK, what the other European countries are doing, their deficit much more higher than what India is reporting now. What's the dilemma there?
To some extent, the dilemma is that we are still an emerging market. Our institutions are probably not as trusted as the institutions of the West. And, historically, when you've looked at debt sustainability, the debt sustainability of emerging markets has been significantly lower than that of industrial countries. That's one reason. So we can't go to the same levels of debt that they can with the same confidence that the markets will not back up and get scared. The second reason is inflation is high in India, right? And your ability in the central bank to absorb huge amounts of government debt is easier when inflation is really low, interest rates are close to zero, and money looks like bonds. So in that sense, there's no difference between the central bank financing and the government financing through bonds. With inflation being much higher, it is much more risky to have central bank financing, especially putting a lot of money out there. So what we're seeing the RBI do is really expand its balance sheet, but largely to absorb foreign exchange reserves. Some of it is devoted to buying government bonds, more government issues through the open market operations, but there's a limit to which it can do that. It can only be a temporary stopgap arrangement because we already have high rates of inflation at 7.5% or so. And you look at the policy rate, which effectively is about 3.5% because the policy rate is the reverse repo rate. We have a real interest rate, which is -4 at this point. That's a very, very low real interest rate. So the RBI's ability to do more at this point depends to some extent on how inflation turns out. And, I think it would be better to follow Shankar's perspective, use the RBI's support for short-term financing if necessary. RBI is essentially intermediating between the banks and the government, but for longer term, it should be the issue of bonds, but better still the sale of government assets, which it has claimed it wants to do, but we've seen very little action on that, even though markets are touching highs once again.
I just want.
Yeah, go please.
Sorry, I just wanted to connect connect to that point. If debt sustainability is an issue, and the second issue is how you approach recovery and revival. What I wanted to, since you are in Chicago and you've seen both sides of the world, and there is a kind of interesting divergence what Prabhu pointed out on how the West approaches it and how emerging economies approach the issue of stimulus and how to spend. Is this driven by sustainability in the sense of that, you look at US, you look at UK, you look at what the EU has done. They are more direct to the people approaches, whereas in India it is more, we would support the businesses or the market and stabilize the banking system. How does one explain this to a layperson in terms of why this divergence in approach? For our reader, for instance, how does one explain this?
Well, I don't know the precise breakup in India of support to businesses and support to households. I mean, in the US, there have been programs like the Paycheck Protection Program targeted at supporting the small and medium enterprises. There has been direct funds transfer to households, a check to every household. But also, what was very, very useful in the early days of the pandemic was unemployment support, $600 per week in addition. So some households were making more from unemployment than they were making in work. But interestingly, it had the effect of a number of households went out and started their own enterprises. Enterprise creation in the US has really zoomed during the pandemic because people said, okay, this is a good chance for me to try something else. And they've been trying new jobs. But also household savings went up. And even though that stimulus has worn off, that $600 is no longer there, households are still able to maintain some spending. That is going to die now, which is why there's a clamor for another package. Now, I don't know that the direction of the stimulus has been that different in the industrial countries from India. What is different is the size. I mean, I think the numbers that are bandied around are all over the place, but most people would agree that the extent of the fiscal stimulus has been relatively small in India. Putting it all together, taking out the double counting, taking out the stuff that is liquidity measures rather than anything else, it's been relatively small, and that partly is because of where we started. We started this pandemic with a fiscal deficit of really, if you look at the public sector borrowing requirement of 10% of GDP.
Yeah.
So take the shrinkage of the economy and the shrinkage of revenues, that adds another 2 or 3 percentage points, which means that before we start doing anything, we're already at 13%. Compare that with European countries, which had before the pandemic a 3% limit on their fiscal deficit if they were to be consistent with the growth and stability pact. In other words, our fiscal management has been terrible. And therefore, by the time the pandemic hit, there was no room, at least in the government's mind, for doing anything more. We have
I
to
mean,
create that.
in addition to that, we migrated from a slowdown to a lockdown, and then that has I I think a large part of even if I take away the spin that is around the stimulus packages of the great number, 7-digit, 8-digit, 9-digit, whatever. I mean, for instance, the fertilizer spend that they have shown in yesterday's stimulus is basically paying off arrears that have been pending with the fertilizer companies. In terms of individual transfers, I think the very powerful transfers have been the transfers to women's accounts of women in the households. I think that was a very smart move. Also, the transfer to the farmers. But yeah, I mean, there is the quantity issue, but I also sense reluctance to support, something like, when the economy was locked down, it took some time for them to sort of push the one nation, one ration card initiative. A lot has been done since then. But if one takes into account what you put the total deficit level, the total debt level, can India sort of come out of this in terms of business as usual policies, or there is you think there is a need for some radical? I mean, we say that never waste a crisis, and I've been this theorist about that change in India comes only after a crisis. So you think that the kind of reforms that have been done in labor code, in agriculture, which is interestingly 30 years after industry was liberalized, agriculture has been liberalized. So do you think they've done enough on that front, enough to propel growth? I mean, it's one thing to borrow and spend now, but to propel growth.
No. Simple answer is no. I think these are moves in the right direction. They need to be monitored carefully. You need to build more consensus politically for them so that they're not disrupted. But you also need to ensure, as with every reform, that intent is followed by actual action on the ground. Sometimes you devise these reforms very cleverly on paper, but when it's rolled out, you find that there's some clause, some institution that you forgot about, which disrupts the whole rollout. I mean, we talked about during the debate, there's a lot about Bihar, where the suspension of the existing sort of laws on mandis and so on didn't do anything for. Now, you need to study those experiences, what went wrong, and make sure that that doesn't happen again. So I think reforms cannot be fire and forget. They have to be continuous management to see that they work as intended. Otherwise, they simply may not function. They exist on paper. You can claim credit for it, but nothing actually happens. But more important, I think, is to enhance the, take labor reforms. They work only as if people want to set up additional investments, want to set up additional factories. What is the motivating force for that going forward? I think there are two possibilities that one should be thinking about. One is external demand. How do we produce for the world? Now, Atmanirbhar is back and forth. Is it about producing for the world? Sometimes there seems to be a logical inconsistency in it. We want to export, but we don't want to import. Now, as any economist knows, that's not possible. You can't just want to export and not import without enormous distortions emerging in the economy. You should be open on both sides. If that is the intent, then this is a good move, because we will be dependent on external demand for some time because of the effects of both the previous slowdown as well as the coronavirus. Second aspect, if you want to energize infrastructure spending of the scale that we need, then clearly some attention to what is holding back infrastructure projects. The government's flagship project is the Ahmedabad-Mumbai high-speed train. And that has been stuck for some time, in part because of land acquisition. So if we don't make land acquisition both more transparent, but also fair and easy, then we're perpetually going to be stuck on infrastructure. And infrastructure is needed for all the reasons that we talked about. Many countries, including China, had their strongest phase of growth when they focused on building out infrastructure and creating the opportunity for industry to come up. Can we do that? But that requires bold moves on how we acquire land in a way that doesn't back up once again, that you don't have protests by a lot of people because it's acquired unfairly. Can we examine our land acquisition process? And of course, in a lot of situations, direct negotiation between acquirer and acquiree is possible. But in cases where there are holdouts, what kind of land acquisition bill can we have, which is easier and draws on best practices in India than the one that we have right now? So these are things we need to think about. I think getting infrastructure going, getting exports going, but also accepting that imports will happen if we have exports is something that we could do a lot more on in this time.
Doctor, I want to ask one question about land acquisition. Most of the time, because of most of the free marketeers, they always want government to acquire and give it to them, the manufacturer. Does it happen in other developing countries like America? The government acquires the land and gives it to the manufacturers at throwaway price?
Well, two points. One, part of the reason for the reliance on the government in India is because of the difficulty with land title, right? Does the person really own the land, or can it be taken from you? So you want to get the government to acquire because that whitewashes the title, and ultimately you're buying the title from the government rather than from a private party. So if we do a much better job in land titling, which I know there are moves, and there are some states which have moved forward, but there are moves now that, for example, Niti Aayog is suggesting, this could be a very major step. Okay, and there is a well-known system, the torrent system. We are, I know, discussing that possibility. If we can roll it out, this would be a really major reform, and it would take the government out of many such acquisitions, because the owner has clear title, and his land is clearly mapped, and therefore the transaction can take place. But the second,
due diligence can be done. For example, you spoke about government takes up the land; it is clean title. Perhaps you may be remembering that when Ashoka Hotel was being sold, it was found that Ashoka older ITT doesn't own the land on which it is constructed. Most of most of the government buildings are constructed on the land which are not owned by them, because Babu forgot to transfer the land in the name of the organization who built them.
I mean, that's part of the problem, right? You hope that the government has better title, and sometimes even that is murky. But
I'm saying market, when you support market forces, why should it be selective? Let the person go to, like Tamil Nadu. Most of the private industries that come up there in Tamil Nadu, your auto centers that come automobile country, then IT people are going. Hyderabad IT people are going. Some land was allotted by the government. Most of them bought directly from the sellers. So this land is a very sensitive issue, as you know, in India, because there are always schemes, because people are selling, like the case happening in Andhra Pradesh, that some people bought the land in advance and sold it to the government of India for constructing the capital. All sorts of things happen in that way. And that land was also given to certain institutions outside the state for setting up industries or institutions. So what I'm saying is that why can't we have a transparency in the system, as you are suggesting, that why should government intervene in any business affair?
right.
That's the emphasis on by most of the reform economists who say, okay, let government do half the work for us, rest half we will do ourselves.
Yeah, no, so I agree entirely with you. If we could clear up this process, and as you said, there are some states, Karnataka, for example, has moved ahead, Andhra Pradesh, Telangana, there are good examples of process. So one is title. The second is, even when you have clear title, when you have public projects, large infrastructure projects, it may well be that you acquire 90% of the land or 95% of the land, and 5% there's somebody who doesn't want to leave. And now that you've bought 95%, they say, okay, pay me a huge amount because you need me to move in order to get the project done, right? So that person who's sitting on that last mile highway, and you need that person off in order to complete the highway. This is where the land acquisition sort of bills come in handy. Even in Western countries, it is called a taking. You're taking the person's property for a public purpose. And so, you may have seen pictures in China of, the entire land being cleared except for one hut in the middle, or one small. Those are situations where you can use the law, you could actually, pay that person a reasonable price, but not an enormous amount, and get them out. And that is where the land acquisition comes in. It should be used as a last resort rather than as a first resort. And in order to get that to happen, land titling, which we've been talking about for 20 years now, is extremely important. I see some moves on the way. It's important they be rolled out quickly.
Dr. I will ask you, you said something in the beginning that in India, the deficit management messed up. What do you mean by that? Deficit
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
You said something about deficit management is messed up.
Yeah.
This is what you said. Can you explain it, how it is messed up?
Well, we have, various, the FRBM Act, for example, which tells us to bring down the deficit. But what we do over time is we have a number which we have to meet in the FRBM. And then we find also ways to meet that number, though the true deficit is higher. So we postpone a lot of spending into the next year. We draw forward a lot of the revenues which were to come in the next year now. This phenomenon of giving a huge amount of refunds to corporations simply because you've asked them to pay in advance what they didn't owe in order to meet your numbers, but also increasing in the last few years public sector borrowing. You're essentially borrowing off balance sheet, getting entities like the Food Corporation of India to borrow for what are essentially government activities. So when you put all the numbers together, and this is something our CAG actually did. So I'm not talking as an outside, based on on a government organization. They basically said that your fiscal numbers don't mean anything, that you are far exceeding the official sort of requirement of the FRBM Act and the true fiscal number. And this is why I say, look at the public sector borrowing requirement, how much the government needs in financing from the markets. That's before the pandemic, on a consolidated basis was more like 10%, when in fact the FRBM requirement was more like 7%. So we were already spending 3 percentage points more than effectively allowed by pushing it here and pushing it there. And of course, this eventually catches up on us. And it caught up on us during the pandemic when we needed to spend more, but the tijori was empty.
Are you saying that fundamentals are not as strong as they are being projected?
I don't know what is being projected. Let me say that we are in a very difficult situation, partly because of the past sort of management of the economy leading to the slowdown, but partly because of the additional effects of the pandemic and the consequences in a large country like India. So we need to be very, very clever in our management going forward. And as Shankar said, we need to certainly enhance the pace of reforms, remembering that we have to compensate for a shrunken productive capacity going forward, which means we need to do everything to enhance new businesses being set up, new investments being set up going forward. So this is really a critical time for India. I mean, I see even the optimistic projections are we will be 10 percentage points less in size than we would have been if nothing had happened, the pandemic hadn't happened a year from now. So think about that, 10 percentage points lower in size relative to what we would have been. Everybody is 10% poorer. I mean, that is a huge number.
Prime Minister Modi in an interview just said that he will be able to achieve the target of $5 trillion economy dollars by 2024. Do you agree with him?
I think the math don't bear it out. I mean, it's simple math. I think even a fifth grader could do it.
No, because he says because our government, means Modi's government, has always achieved the target it's fixed for itself.
I'm sorry, the Modi government.
He claimed that he has always achieved the target which he has fixed for his government. There's a track record of achieving the targets, and this target will also be achieved by 2024.
Well, I mean, go back to Shankar's point. Was the target a significant slowdown in the economy before the pandemic? If so, we achieved it, but I don't think that was the target.
I'm talking $5 trillion economy because that target has not been reduced so
Well,
far.
let's say we are, we were 2.8 trillion or so before the pandemic.
Correct.
Let's say we go down to 2.6 as a result of the pandemic. Remember, we're shrinking by about 10 percentage points this year. Then that leaves us 3 or 4 years to effectively double. We have to do a tremendous amount. We probably will be the fastest growing economy in history of this size. I mean, nothing is impossible. Nothing is impossible, and it's good. I think it's good for leadership to set strong targets, but it is very important to put in place realistic measures to achieve that target. And if we are to achieve that, then everything we've talked about, plus much more, has to be done over the time that we're talking about.
We have been the fastest growing economy, I think, once upon a time during this decade, isn't it?
I don't think so. At this point, I think if you look at the fastest growing economy, I mean, these numbers, can be moved depending on when your starting point, et cetera, is.
Yeah, that's
I mean, the reality is we've done quite well. So I don't want to dump on our 25 years, we grew at about 7%. That's a great number for a country of our size. We should not deride that number. But we have a neighbor to the north who, over the period, we were about the same in the early 1980s. Now they are 4.5 to 5 times the size of our economy. And, we have security concerns. So unfortunately, even though we've done quite well, we cannot relax on that. India's image in the rest of the world depends on it being seen as a strong alternative to other regimes, including China. And I think at this point, given our economic difficulties, I'm not talking about our geopolitical issues, but given our economic difficulties, there is much less of a focus on India than there used to be maybe 10 years ago. And I think that is unfortunate. I think we do have to restore very high levels of growth, and the world will come flocking back to us. But it is important that we undertake that task now. Again, Shankar's point that, crisis offers opportunity, and the urgency of the moment, if we can seize that, I do very much wish that Prime Minister Modi's sort of target is met. It is an extremely challenging one.
So you're saying that it's not in terms of fundamental economy, the way we are in the economy, and in terms of the geopolitics. I mean, India is going to be chairing the G20 in 2022, and there's a big buzz about that. So it's not an option, but an imperative that sort of faces us both in terms of the economic security and the national security.
I absolutely affirm that. I agree entirely with that statement.
And yeah, Shankar, complete, please.
I mean, and to me, the most worrying part is that we were not producing enough jobs till 2018, 2019, and then after the pandemic, that there is an entire class of 2019, 2020, which I sympathize with them and I worry for them as to how they will find jobs and where they will enter. Hopefully, they will, as in other places, be job creators rather than being employed. But if in a lower growth scenario, even if we rebound strongly, adding 10 million jobs, when every other country is sort of having its own Atmanirbhar program, there is Atmanirbhar America, Atmanirbhar China, even the recent. So how much scope do we have to export our way out, or how much scope do we have to build if we were to double to $5 trillion, for instance?
So it's a great question. And, I think the advantage we have is relatively low-lying fruit, that there are many things we can do to enhance our productivity, our logistics, our ability to do better than where we are. And of course, our labor is still modestly priced. And so we can take advantage of all this. But you're absolutely right. The world is not going to come to India, and we effectively have to go to the world. And we do that by showing how we've done what is necessary to change the image of India as a difficult place to do business in, as a place where all sorts of new rules and regulations come up in a haphazard way. There is an imperative to change both the reality on the ground, but also spread the message more widely that India is open for business, willing to do business, and is both going to accept investment, but also is going to be a good place to make stuff. So I mean, my sense is that you need urgency. That you're absolutely right. We sort of get overly taken in by growth numbers. You have a steep fall, obviously you're going to have a strong growth. And this quarter is going to be spectacular growth. Never in India's history have we grown so much, but we will still end the year 10% below where we were. So don't keep talking about growth. Talk about the level of GDP and talk about jobs, because you need new jobs, not just to replace the jobs that have died as a result of the pandemic, but also to create more jobs for our youth who keep entering the labor force. The longer we delay this, the more the eventual problem.
Professor, don't you think the time has come to create more demand rather than the emphasis on reform that will lead to more supply already? How do you create more demand so that there is some kind of revival of growth, unless because a huge economy, size of the market in India, but because most of the industries in India, manufacturing sector, have survived because of the growth of rural demand happening. Don't you think we should have some kind of a mechanism where we create extra excessive demand to create, not only absorb the supply, but also demand for more supply?
Well, so that's where I said infrastructure has often been the key, especially in a large country like ours, to create both more demand, create more jobs, as well as create more supply, because you build better roads, better logistics, etc. Every Asian country has grown on the basis of a strong infrastructure push. And there is no reason why we shouldn't do that also. But for that, we need to examine the key bottlenecks. We've sort of given up on infrastructure seemingly, because of the bad experience of the projects that were started in the late, 2007, 2008, before the crisis. But we need to look at it again. What is it that's holding us back? And if we are to go to whatever, I would say just increase the pace of growth back to 9 and 10%, that would be great in its own right. That would not get us to 5 trillion, but would be great. If we want to go there, we absolutely have to look at these issues very carefully, very quickly.
Doctor, if you can give us some estimate, I know if we have to achieve $5 trillion target by 2024, at what rate it should grow from now, India?
Well, you basically have to grow. I mean, let's just do simple math, right? You've got 4 years. 4 years, you have to double your economy. Even at simple interest or simple, you have to grow it by 25% a year.
And the economy has grown by that much?
What's that? Yeah, I'm just saying that. I mean, those are numbers which.
Because you said in the beginning you were optimistic that we can achieve this. And when you're saying the 25% per annum, it has to grow to achieve 5 million.
I am saying that I see this as an aspirational goal, not a real goal.
Okay.
If that is what it is, then just maintaining that aspirational goal requires tremendous number of things to do. Is there any probability we'll achieve it? Nothing is impossible, but I would say the probability is vanishingly small. That said, we can go up to 8-10%. that would itself require many more reforms and much better economic management than we have seen so far. If we can do that, I would be clapping from from the rooftops for that kind of performance. So let's do
what is the probability?
I'm hopeful. I'm always hopeful about India. I'm always hopeful that the nature of the country we change, but we haven't done serious reforms of the kind we need since the last NDA government in 2004. So we do need to pick up the pace of reform for sure.
I have a question which may sound personal or political, but I mean it needs to be asked. You have been in conversations, Professor, with the leadership in the Congress party. I believe certain state governments have also consulted you. You were also highly regarded by the Modi government while you were in the Reserve Bank of India. Mr. Modi has sort of publicly acknowledged your expertise. Is there any conversation between you and the government on specifically on fiscal management or on reforms that need to be done? I mean, your entry into Government of India started with, I think, your report on the financial sector during the Manmohan Singh regime, and then sort of we progressed here. So, are you in conversation? Have they approached you? Is there are they seeking your counsel?
No, look, I am open to dialogue with anybody who wants to talk to me. And I've certainly had conversations with with certain people in government, not on an official basis, but on a back channel basis. But no, I haven't had any official discussions with the government.
So let me go back to history, because you were very comfortable with the then Finance Minister Arun Jaitley, and I just want to, you are given some explanation somewhere. And what were the reasons for you opting out of RBI? Which you have not told anybody so far.
This is old history. I've said what I could about it, and I think one should move on. There's always more interesting stuff to talk about.
Shankar, ask the last question, because we have done 1 hour almost.
So does move on mean that the circle you might circle back to India? Is there room to speculate that you might be the next Manmohan Singh?
In the Narasimha government.
Right. So one should never speculate on hypotheticals. But look, I have been very happy talking to the public using my sort of platform at the University of Chicago. I do talk to a lot of young people, and it's back to doing research, writing books, and so on. But I'm always open to dialogue whenever anybody has questions, and I do respond.
Prabhu, you went to D school. Economists always speak in their ambidextrous, the one hand and the other hand conversation.
We used to hear, there were 6 economies, there will be 7 opinions. Now I see there are 6 economies, there can be 9 opinions.
So I think Professor Rajan has sort of skirted the question whether he's heading back to a political career or a technocrat career in politics, but we'll wait for how that translates, how that happens. Thank you, Professor. Thank you for your time. And this has been a very enlightening, interesting conversation at EE Expressions platform of New Indian Express. Thank you.